Hi everyone, I'm Jim. This is Great Books, Big Ideas. Thanks for joining me. Today I want to talk about a book that I recently reread. It's called A Great Idea at the Time, The Rise, Fall, and Curious Afterlife of the Great Books. It's written by Alex Beam, who was a journalist and columnist. I think he's probably most famous as a columnist for the Boston Globe. And he's in this book, he's talking about the fad of great books in mid 20th century middlebrow America. So the particular focus is on the great books of the Western world. I read this shortly after it came out, if memory serves. It came out in 2008. I might have read it in 2009 or 2010. And I recently reread it on my Kindle app on my original iPad. That's an iPad 1, which barely works anymore, but it does still read books, which is pretty cool. Anyway, so when I first read this book, what is this book about? I want to do a quick review of it, but I don't want to do a detailed review. I actually want to talk about this book at a summary level and then show you a little bit about how I maybe will plan to use it to open up some lanes of research and exploration for the channel. So in this book, Alex Beam, in a very breezy, sort of snarky style, he digs into this phenomenon that happened where in the mid 20th century, all of a sudden classic books were kind of popular and people were joining discussion groups and reading these books together and conversing about them. And it literally became a fad, especially in the Midwest. I think it was had particular traction, and it was a movement that involves many of the main figures that were involved with the Great Books of the Western World set that I've been talking about on the channel. And people like Robert Maynard Hutchins and Mortimer Adler, they are, as it were, protagonists in the book. So in this book by Beam, he goes through the history of it. He's done a little bit of research, he's dug into some archives, he's talked to people, and he explains where this phenomenon came from. And it started, long story short, sort of an outgrowth out of the Columbia University General Honors courses that were spearheaded by a man by the name of John Erskine. And then Mortimer Adler, and I also believe Robert Maynard Hutchins were involved with that. They took classes under Erskine and they started teaching themselves. These classes were sort of seminar style and people would talk about great works. And whether it was philosophy or literature or history or political theory. And they were team taught courses. And so these guys sort of were involved with all that. And it started to like branch out from Columbia to other venues. And I think Adler and Hutchins saw that this model of talking about books and educating this way could maybe have wider reach, that it wasn't just an Ivy League thing. So they tried to popularize it, in effect. So Robert Maynard Hutchins, you learn a lot about his life in this book. He led a pretty glamorous, elite life. He was sort of a debonair, sort of popular fellow. He made it to the cover of Time magazine once or twice, and people generally found him very fetching and affable and interesting, and he had a glamorous wife and so forth. And he later went on to, I think he became the dean of the Yale Law School, and then he became the president of the University of Chicago. And Mortimer Adler started to sort of trail him, and they became friends and kind of compadres. And Adler ended up coming out to Chicago and teaching there. And John Dewey, by the way, was at the University of Chicago, though he was more of a foe to these guys. And the book gets into that a little bit. But at University of Chicago, like in and around this time, they founded this Great Books Foundation. It's an organization that's still around today, where people could like form these discussion groups, or book clubs, maybe you'd call them, but they would talk about these works. And they confronted a problem, though, as they were trying to disseminate this, in that some of these texts that they were teaching were a little bit hard to obtain. So it was hard to find standard editions of them. And that kind of planted the seed for some publishing ventures. And eventually what happened was Britannica, known for the Encyclopedia Britannica, in my day that was the best of the encyclopedias out there, they got in on the action. They sort of joined forces with the University of Chicago, or University of Chicago allowed their name to be branded on the great books of the Western world, and they made some money off of that. And so these forces joined with Adler and Hutchins kind of at the helm, and they came up with this Great Books of the Western World set. And a lot of the book describes sort of their deliberations over, what's going to make the list, what books are we going to include in this, what are we going to leave out, and there's lots of interesting anecdotes and things that we learn about, the process they went through with that. William Benton was sort of the publisher involved from Britannica, and he later became a United States senator, so he was heavily involved. And so you learn about the whole history of this movement, how they were appealing to the business class and getting them involved in great books, how they were appealing to the working classes and the suburbanites and getting them involved in these things. And eventually this all gelled into a sort of post-World War II phenomenon where they published these great books of the Western world and put them out there for the public to buy, these sets. And the initial splash was splashy. They had a pretty good first year, but then sales severely dropped off after that in the subsequent years. So the Britannica tried to double down and figure out some new ways to sell these books. So they basically got a lot more aggressive about marketing them. A lot of door-to-door encyclopedia salesmen got in on the action. Some shady business practices were used to sort of lure people into buying these great book sets. They came up with lots of supplements to upsell customers once they had bought these sets. And the books got pretty popular, and in the late 50s and early 60s was probably their high water mark. And then this story is related by Alex Beam in a pretty entertaining way. I'll give him credit. So after that peaked, then they started getting in trouble. There were investigations about some of these shady business practices and sales tactics and so forth. And the late 60s was a period of tumult in our society, and the great books movement was not unscathed from that. So they became frowned upon. They were seen as sort of stodgy and elitist, and became kind of like, we don't want to get involved with this. But the books kept going into the 70s. Attempts were still made to sell them. You would still see ads for them and so forth. And then in the late 80s and 1990, a new edition of the Great Books of the Western World was issued. And I promise I'm going to talk about those really soon. I have a set of those, and it's a different table of contents. They made some additions and some deletions from the list, and it's really interesting to compare the two editions. And this was really a last gasp, though. This was in the midst of the culture wars and multiculturalism and all that, and it seemed like the right wing, the conservative right, started to glom on to the great books as well as the Christian right. And they were sort of like claiming that and I would say co-opting the great books movement, although maybe people like Adler were sort of willing in that. But it became very politicized. So whereas in the 50s and early 60s, pretty much, all doors were open. Anyone could come in and read the great books. It wasn't really a big deal. By the 90s, it was polarized. And, if you were from the left side of the spectrum, it wasn't really cool to be reading the great books of the Western world because it had too many dead white males in it and whatnot. And so that's all kind of a sidebar to it. But basically, the movement petered out. Alex Beam also talks at some length about St. John's College, which is still going in Annapolis, Maryland, and Santa Fe, New Mexico. That's the one school. There are other schools out there that take a great books approach to education, but St. John's is sort of the poster child for it, and they really take it seriously. And the people who founded St. John's College were closely affiliated with Adler and Hutchins and all the rest. So you can learn a little bit about that and sort of the unique type of student that goes to a place like that. And then he also profiles sort of the aftermath, the afterlife, he calls it, of the great books fad, where there's a legacy here. People still do read these books and they're interested in these sets. And he profiles some of those people towards the end of the book. And by the end, he sort of actually goes on, sort of attends one of these like great books meetups and starts reading the books and sort of conversing with people about it. And it seems to me like Alex Beam maybe had a more interesting, better time doing that than he thought, because his attitude in this book is, I find it, when I first read it, I was pretty bothered by it. Like he's very snarky. He can't stand Mortimer Adler. I mean, he basically bullies him throughout the book. He calls him a troll, a hobbit. He's nebbish. He's just kind of like this self-promoter, self-aggrandizing type of guy. Who was, just sort of a tough-nosed kind of like bore. And Robert Hutchins fares better, although he's also in a little bit ways made the fool. He talks about how both gentlemen at the end of their lives felt like their lives were a failure, which is interesting. I'd like to look into that a little bit more. But I thought he was a little unfair towards Adler, and it's almost like he needed a antagonist to sort of do what he was doing with the book. He needed a foil, and Adler is the foil. And he kind of mocks people. He sort of jokes about, some of the selections, like some of these math and science books that no one was ever going to read. And he's a little bit mystified, head scratching, like, how did this ever even happen? Like that these discussion groups and these books had a heyday, that they were popular. He talks about middle brow culture, and it's very, there's a lot of good raw material in the book, even though I don't always like the way that he portrays it. But I kind of get what he's doing. He's trying to write in a breezy, accessible style. He's not trying to be stuffy about it. And largely it's a successful book. But I do feel like, his attitude was bothersome to me, like a bit of a turnoff. But with that as a proviso, I would say this: if you want to learn about this movement, this is a really good entry point. It's a good gateway into it. And then you can fan out and start doing your own research, reading more, which is what I did. He gave me a lot of leads. So he gave me some names, people who are quoted in the book, research that he leaned on. that give you, I think, a more fair-minded assessment of what was going on. And what I hope to do is in future videos start probing some of these avenues that Alex Beam opens up for us. And we'll start, looking at some of the early history of where this all came from. I'm really interested, just as I wouldn't call it a scholarly pursuit, because I don't think of myself as a scholar, but it's just as kind of a bibliophile and someone who just likes to think about things. Like, I'm really interested in the canon and where it comes from and how it changes and how this whole notion of classic books come into being. And for that, you're going to have to go all the way back to the Victorian period, if not before, but especially like the Victorian, late Victorian period. And also Harvard University is involved with this. He talks about the Harvard classics. He talks about the changes in Harvard University that were a big turnoff to people like Hutchins, and sort of inspired him to think of a different way to approach education, and also people like John Erskine at Columbia. So a lot of these figures I want to look at in some more detail. And then we'll also think about like the appeal that these books had to the middle classes especially. And I'm interested in middlebrow culture. And Alex Beam cites one scholar in particular. I think her name's Joan Shelley Rubin, who's written a good book that I read. These are library books that are of interest. Tim Lacey is another one who wrote a dissertation about Mortimer Adler and the great books movement, and that was published. It's a book that you can get through interlibrary loan. I've read that one, and that was really good. So those sources are like higher quality, whereas Alex Beam is just kind of giving into sort of the superficial armchair, spitballing type approach to the great books movement. But it is useful. Like, he does give you a lot to go on and go with. And for that, I'm thankful to Alex Beam. Now, when I reread the book just a couple weeks ago, I probably enjoyed it even more than on the first read through. Maybe I wasn't as turned off by the style because I was prepared for it. I knew it was going to be that way. And it's a fast read. So I believe the book's still in print. It's published by Public Affairs, which is part of the Hatchet book group. And you can still find it out there, used copies, new copies. I do give it a cautious recommendation. Just keep in mind that just try not to be offended or insulted by his approach, because it's, he is kind of snarky with his style. But if you can overlook that, you're going to learn a lot about this great books movement, which just totally fascinates me. The whole thing just kind of, the fact that these books were ever popular and had a heyday is just something I'm still trying to wrap my mind around. And it's fun, just this phenomenon is one of these pop culture type things that happens. And I think Alex Beam noticed this, and he was like, I want to look into this. It's a great idea for a book. And I think he, by and large, was successful at pulling this off. So again, not a new book. It's from 2008. It's probably been reviewed by people on YouTube already, which is fine. But I'm just kind of adding my 2 cents worth to it. Consider checking it out. But I wanted to explain what I want to do with this book. So, like I said, I really just want to sort of take some of these doors that he opens in the book and explore them a little bit more. So we're going to look at some of the figures, some of the history of this, and just sort of have fun wandering our way through this phenomenon. And I'll show you some things I've collected along over the years that are kind of fun to look at as well. So if you're interested in the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, that mid-century, what America was into, this is really a nice look back at all that. And the fact of the matter is, none of this has really totally gone away either. Yes, the fad is gone. These books aren't popular. Those 1990 version 2 Great Books of the Western Worlds didn't sell well at all. And, you know, it had its time, its day in the sun. Money was made, money was lost. And now the aftermath, the afterlife. You know what? We're still out here reading these books, some of us. We're still enjoying them and learning a lot from them. So anyway, that's a great idea at the time, The Rise, Fall, and Curious Afterlife of the Great Books. If you've read this book, tell me what your thoughts on it. Opinions seem to split on it. If you go to Amazon reviews, probably Goodreads too, like you're going to find people who hate the book, people who think it's really good and fun, but that can get some interesting back and forth going. Also, if you have some leads, if you think like, hey, you should look into this, look at this person, or you're curious about somebody or some kind of book series that was published or something, let me know in the comments and I will add it to my increasingly long list of things to make videos about for Great Books, Big Ideas. Thanks for watching. Give me a thumbs up and subscribe if you're new to the channel. And I hope to see you soon. Bye.